All right, folks, so it's our right and responsibility as citizens to know the roles and functions of both the government and the opposition. And this morning we'll be zooming in on the power of the opposition. We've invited political scientist from the New Jersey City University, Dr. McCalpin, to join in on this conversation. Well, not even to join in, but to tell us what's going on. Morning, my friend. Welcome to Smile Jamaica.
Greetings, Neville. Greetings, Empress.
Good to see you. Good to see you, Jermaine. Wow. I think we could start your opinion on the recent elections and the outcome. Let's start there.
Well, my predictions for those who were, around was 37-26 to the JLP. So I was somewhat surprised at the overwhelming majority of the JLP. And so I think a lot of persons more or less predicted a JLP victory. I think the margin of victory was what was surprising. And in the aftermath, it's almost like a hurricane. In the aftermath, it's assessing the damage and also talking about how we rebuild, which is where the PNP now finds itself, in terms of its review committee. But it's whether or not the review will not only resonate, but would be implemented, because they've had two previous reviews, and I'm not sure that some of the points from those reviews were actually properly borne in mind in this election cycle.
Okay.
Yeah, I think all of us probably were surprised by the margin of victory. What do you think contributed to that? Yeah, I think everyone, if you read the polls and the people on the ground, you probably thought that the GLP would win, but the margin, as you said, was a surprise. What do you think contributed to that?
There are several things. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, and a lot will fall on the leader, but I make a distinction between blame and responsibility. Leader has to take responsibility irrespective of the outcome. I think it was a large scale and a wide scale growing impatience with the PNP's lack of fundamental change, and I'm not talking in terms of its ideas or ethos, to be transformational. And so I think persons became frustrated. All the other things about vote buying and all these other things, and COVID and the low voter turnout, means that it wasn't an endorsement of the JLP. The reality of it is that the PNP was rejected. They were rejected because their message hasn't changed, their appeal hasn't changed, the perception that they're anachronistic and stuck in the past and the halcyon and glory days, I think came through. Being a credible alternative and offering ideas that would appear to be not just sound, but practical and possible. And so I think the JLP outmaneuvered the PNP in that regard in terms of its messaging.
Yeah. Having said that, and you were really asked this morning to talk about the role of the opposition,
Yes.
and some people started by saying, well, we're not going to have a good opposition. I said 14 is good enough. What are your thoughts on that?
Sometimes we play a numbers game, and democracy is more than a numbers game. It's a tug of war between debate, consensus, dissension, and agreement. And though most people would think 33-30 would be the ideal, I think the reality of it is that there would be a lot of inertia, and the business of the people would not necessarily get done as much. So you need some kind of room between these two parties, because our political system, an extreme version of the Westminster Whitehall, does not tend towards consensus, but rather towards conflict. I believe that there are four key roles of an effective democratic opposition, and it's not just whether or not one has won significantly more or significantly less seats. Yes, the JLP has 75% of the lower house of representatives, and the PNP the remaining 25%. But I still believe that there are four key roles that the PNP can play towards building an effective opposition. So if I can share those,
please.
So that
Yeah, please.
the first and most obvious role of an effective democratic opposition, and in this case the PNP, is to impact policy making. Some may argue that, well, they don't have a say in the lower house. I don't agree. They can still make their voices known, right? Legislation is done in a bicameral, two chambers. They make up 38% of the Senate. They are still critical in impacting policy making, right? So they can't wilt away to say, well, we don't have poor numbers in the lower house, so we should forget policy making. PNP still has a role to play in policy making. The second role of an effective opposition in our system is to keep the government in check. The government did not get a license to do what it wants or what it feels it should do without proper consultation. So to keep the government in check, the opposition has to focus on consultation, but primarily holding the government accountable and responsible. In other words, transparency. And whether you have 14 seats or 30 seats, that is still required.
Before you go to number 3, keep the government in check. I agree with you. But then if there's a vote in the House, the opposition can't do anything about it. They don't have enough. They don't have the numbers, do they?
But remember that policy and legislation requires both houses. So even if it gets through without significant dissent, because they have a more than a 2/3 majority, it has to go to the upper house, which is the Senate, where the distribution is less askew. So policy making and keeping the government in check, I'm not saying it is going to be that they will stop everything, but the reality is that we have a bicameral legislature, and bills are ultimately done and decided through the two houses.
Yep.
So the PNP still has a role to play.
Number 3.
Number 3 is that you have to offer credible policy alternatives to what the government proposes, right? So if the government proposes a tax, for argument's sake, a levy on imported cars, the opposition is required, an effective opposition has to have credible policy alternatives to whatever the ruling party initiates, right? And I think we can't undersell the reality that what is making the challenge of an effective opposition is not really the numbers, but it's the leadership question. And so that brings me to the fourth role of an effective opposition, and that is provide a credible alternative to the current government. And that is where the leadership issue is significant in making an opposition effective. It's not the numbers, ultimately, it is leadership. So the quicker the PNP resolves the leadership conundrum, I think they are in the toe and in tow in being a more effective opposition. But you can't be an effective opposition without having a clear, decisive, and consensus-building leader of the opposition. And for me, those are the 4 key roles in an effective democratic opposition. And the PNP has to work out the leadership thing if they are going to be effective.
Dr. McCalpin, Jermaine, who do you think would succeed as the next party leader of the People's National Party? Who do you think is in the best position to take over from Dr. Peter Phillips?
You know, it's one of those situations where you have about 10 possibilities, but I think in terms of credible alternatives or in terms of leadership options, I think about 3, and my top 3 are Peter Bunting, Lisa Hanna, and I would put someone that was recently appointed or reappointed to the Senate, and I would put Norman Horn. And people may be looking at me like I have 2 heads, but for me, I think the party now has to look outside of the unusual suspects, right? So Peter Bunting came second in the leadership race, and though he lost his seat, it is not unprecedented for a leader of the opposition to not have won their constituency.
As far as I know, he can be the president, but he can't be the leader of the opposition because he didn't win a seat. Isn't that so?
Well, the Governor General, by their own concert, can appoint anyone from the party that lost the elections to be leader of the opposition, because we have the situation in many Caribbean islands, including Barbados in 2018, where the ruling party won all the seats. So we have had that in Grenada about 3 times in the last 20 years. So a leader of the opposition can be appointed based on the suggestions of the party and essentially the interpretations of the Governor General. because that's one of the roles of the Governor General.
I want to ask you, you mentioned Barbados, removing the Queen as the head of state. Is Barbados going there now? What's happening there with their political structure?
Well, they had a constitutional review in 1998, and it was essentially founded, decided that they would move from a monarchical to a republican system of government. And so in 2015, then Prime Minister Frondell Stewart essentially continued within that same vein. So there is now this timetable that the intention is by 2021, next year, to remove the Queen as the head of state and therefore transition to a presidential type system. We're not sure what the model they will espouse looks like, but that is what is happening. And when I think of the Jamaican parallel, we have been dancing around this issue for quite some time. And the JLP, in the debates, the leader argued that they would bring such a thing, or rather Kamina Johnson-Smith had said they would bring such a thing to the people as a referendum.
All right.
In terms of the Queen.
And for the people now, what would they have to do? I want to talk now just quickly in empowering the people to advocate, to call for what they want, and to understand the process of going to a referendum and what it would mean to remove the Queen as the head of the state and hold the government accountable. What must the people do?
Well, the first thing is that the government has to make it clear as to whether or not the referendum, because referenda in democracies serve two purposes. They can be consultative or they can be decision-making, right? So you just want to get a feel. It doesn't mean that it is binding, right? So you have binding referendum and consultative referendum. People therefore have to be educated to understand that in removing the Queen and therefore the monarchy, these are the implications for how Jamaica operates. As a presidential system, a ceremonial head would now be the president and the executive would be the prime minister, or we may move to directly electing a president, in terms of leading the country. So I think the public education has to begin, because the last poll says that 57% of Jamaicans believe that the Queen should be removed as head of state. And so I think public education has to be ramped up to tell the people about what it means to remove the monarchy as the head of state, the monarch as head of state. So public education is going to be definitely important, but the government has to be transparent as to whether or not they just want to get a sense of what people think, which I can't see why they would, because polls have already pointed to the majority wanting to do away with the Queen, or it is going to be a binding referendum.
Jermaine, thanks very much. Good to see you. Stay safe, my friend.
See you. All right, take care.
Thank you, Doc. I must say, it was very informative, and we need to have many more of these conversations. And one thing that just stood out for me is public education. If anything, the most important point, we must educate the people, and we must stay educated and exercise our right to have a voice.
All right.